I have here John Sauven, the Executive Director of Greenpeace, and I'm going to talk to John about the recent Paris meeting on climate change and the agreements reached by the world's governments. John, how do you see the results of this meeting? Because many people have claimed that it's a success, but there are a number of people who doubt the success. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, I think when you talk about Paris, I mean, it's a bit partly dependent on your sort of personal outlook rather than, say, a scientific statement, because I think it's a question of, you know, are you a glass half full person or a glass half empty person? Because you can be both optimistic about the Paris outcome or you could be pessimistic. I mean, I tend to take an optimistic view because all of the world's countries that were there, 195, all of them signed up to the Paris Agreement and signed up to what was quite a radical agreement to keep global average temperatures below 2 degrees, aim for 1.5 degrees, something that had been put forward by extremely vulnerable low-lying states, which ultimately got the support of all the delegates. So in a way, Paris, and only time will tell, was, I think, quite a historic moment in the history of the world, because I think it did mark a time when people decided finally that collectively, globally, as a community, we were going to be serious about tackling the issue of climate change. And this wasn't just going to be rich countries against poor countries, but this was going to be everybody. So it included China, that's responsible for about 23% of emissions. It included India, which will be the world's #1 when it comes to emissions going into the atmosphere in the coming decades. So without some of these fast developing countries, the agreement wouldn't really mean anything. We have to get these big emitters into the room, whether historically they're responsible or not. But then I think on the other side, the rich countries' commitment is not only just to quicken the pace of their own decarbonisation, their own switch to renewable energy, but I think also the onus is on them to provide technical and financial assistance. But I think if those things happen, then I think Paris will be seen as positive, and I think the outcome will be very good.
Okay, John, we've heard that the developing countries, along with the advanced countries, have signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement. But there are a number of developing countries who have expressed fears about these global climate agreements actually damaging their development. How do you see this agreement in terms of their development prospects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fair point, because of course, you know, the Paris Agreement is not legally binding. It doesn't commit legally rich countries to either cut their emissions or provide financial assistance in terms of other international treaties. This is very much a kind of bottom-up approach where people have come along with their national plans, they put them on the table. I mean, there is one aspect which is more binding, and that is that the plans they put on the table are mandatory, and they've got to be put on the table every 5 years. And each plan has to be better than the one before, so they can't go backwards, they have to go forwards. But I think that the big issue, though, is in terms of for developing countries, because not only do they need to grow, not only do they have to deal with issues around poverty and the fact that many people in developing countries lack access to energy, full stop, whether it's clean or polluting. But if we're going to go down a clean energy pathway, then they have to get financial assistance and they have to get technical assistance, because otherwise this is not going to work. And that's why I think it is absolutely critical that the rich countries have to provide the assistance in both public money and in terms of private money to enable this transition to take place.
Okay, John, you've mentioned the issue of finance. I'd like to ask you for more details on that, because obviously this is the make or break of the climate agreement. We need the finance, we need the alternate technology, we need the change in practices. Where do you think this money is going to come from in greater detail?
Well, look, finance can come from many places. A lot of people have said, oh, well, you know, public finance is not going to come from rich countries because rich countries are going through austerity and government cutbacks and budgets are being slashed and so on and so forth. So I accept that in terms of like more public money in the form of aid or whatever is not going to be there in the kinds of sums that are required to go down a kind of clean energy transition pathway for developing countries. So some of this will be public money, but I think what's absolutely critical is that private money and money coming from international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF is actually put for promoting clean energy, clean development, and that the idea that in future that you might get funding, say, for new coal-fired power stations will be a thing of the past, but that you will get money, for example, the development of renewable energy or energy efficiency, or even in terms of, for example, land use, which is also another big source of emissions coming from deforestation and other land use changes, is that countries will get money for committing to protect, say, rainforests, or even to allow the regeneration of rainforests, because they're such an important carbon sink. And they should get money for providing that kind of service, because it is a global service. It's not just applicable to the nation state. That impacts the whole world, and they should be financed for doing that.